Hello, everyone. I'm Hal Levy at PYMNTS.com, and I'm joined today by Laura Sullivan, who is Senior Product Manager at Form3. We're happy to have you and welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're discussing Fedwire, and we'll get started with a 10,000-foot view. We'll start to dig in a little bit. So when we start to think about the features that are inherent to the Fedwire service that are most immediately useful to the FI, all banks, all providers want to broaden what they offer their end customer. They want to be cutting edge. They want to be technologically and technically advanced. So let's talk about what might be the low-hanging fruit. What to your mind are the new features and the ones that would be coming down the line toward us as Fedwire really is cemented? What's going to be the low-hanging fruit that we see?
I think that, ISO 20022 is the obvious answer, but I will add in some color to that. ISO 20022 has been discussed for probably 6 or 7 years, even in the US, and the US is behind many of the other countries around the world in adopting ISO. But it is a wealth of relatively well-structured data, and there are lots and lots of use cases for that. What has been interesting, and I don't think this is unique to the US, is I think that banks have been so focused on making the change from the existing formats to ISO, or implementing brand new systems in many respects. Something like RTP, FedNow, will be brand new systems using ISO, that they really haven't mined effectively all of the uses of ISO. I really believe that once banks make the leap to ISO, they got to get that under their belt, because it is not a small undertaking. But once they get that under their belts, I believe that banks and fintechs will start coming up with many, many use cases where they can really leverage that data. I've seen some interesting stories, one use case in particular out of Canada, where a relatively small company was saving, several $100,000 a year by using the data that was available with ISO 20022, just to tweak and fine tune their accounts payable and receivable processes. But I don't think there's been as much emphasis on that, because the banks have been so focused, rightfully, on just making the transition to the ISO format.
To that point, and you're alluding to it, let's delve into it a little more fully. Making that transition implies there are a little bit of some hurdles, we'll call them pain points. So what are you seeing when we discuss what the transition entailed? Maybe what the immediate challenges of doing that, right? Because there are some dates for really getting underway. We'll talk here about Fedwire, we'll talk about chips. There are some pain points. I would suspect there might even be some cultural mindset shifts that have to be part of that. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was looking back at the Fedwire format has been relatively unchanged. I was looking at a document not long ago that was dated 1997, and the format was relatively the same. So this is a huge change for the industry to move to ISO. And it is not, I think most of us, certainly I would put myself in that category, thought that it would be a relatively easy transition, one-for-one fields on Fedwire, because my gosh, ISO has, I actually sat down and counted one day, and in a customer transfer on ISO, there are 2,000 different fields, 2,000 different elements, like literally just out of curiosity counted. And so when you look at it, you think, oh, well, there's got to be a place for everything. And what we're finding is there is not, and there is some data that there really isn't a great place to put into an ISO format. And so banks are going to have to do some conversion, it's not just obvious one-to-one mapping. There are some fields that got added for communicating instructions among banks that just don't translate well into ISO. The other, big thing, gorilla, I'll say, down the road is that ultimately the payments practices groups are going to mandate structured addresses. And that is, going to be a huge hurdle in the US, because most of the addresses that are provided in wire transfers, particularly on the origination side, come from your customer demand deposit systems. And those don't understand structured addresses. So, banks are going to have to step back and look at, how do you take a demand deposit system that, just has 8 lines of address and put it into some sort of structured format? It has huge benefits because, one of the chief things that banks should be able to leverage that for is when they do sanction scanning, they can target, and understand that if they see the word Cuba in a street name, it's okay. Whereas if it's in the country name, it's a concern. So, it has a lot of promise, but getting there is going to be quite challenging for banks.
The idea that, the concept of it, there should be a one-to-one relationship, and yet there is not, makes me wonder, does the future-proofing of this, is that even possible to really get this in place where providers, where banks can rest easy that they are getting the right support, provider relationship, all their ducks in a row, so to speak, so that they don't have to worry about obviously what could be some hiccups in the data transmission, which then causes hiccups down the line, right? And clearly we wouldn't have the optimal use of Fedwire that we'd like to. How do you start to do 2 things? How do you start to address these pain points? Number 1, how do you start to move toward a future-proofing, that's my word, please use your own, establishment or concept to really get all of this rich data in place?
And that's a great point and a great question. I really, what a bank has to really think about is, there have been some solutions, and particularly if you're looking, so I'll start with, the good news is virtually every system in the world is going to ISO. So, that is a huge accomplishment, that virtually the entire world will be using the same format. So particularly when you are looking at global payments and being able to do things globally, you will have the same format. Even within the US, the fact that RTP, FedNow, chips, Fedwire will all be ISO is a huge benefit. So at least there's a pretty clear direction of where you need to be headed. But what banks really need to look at are solutions that will service those multiple different rails without having to, jump through hoops and get from one to the other. So that's a huge potential benefit, is that I can potentially take a Fedwire payment and send it RTP or FedNow, or vice versa. And so really, what banks need to be careful about is, to use a colloquial phrase, not putting lipstick on a pig and making it look like it's ISO when it's really not. Sooner or later, to future-proof yourself, to your question, you really need to rip the Band-Aid off and truly make your payment systems, your payment hub, whatever you want to call it, your payment rail, ISO based. And the longer you delay that, the less future-proof you are, because none of us today, I don't believe, can guess how the payment volumes are going to morph. What's going to move from ACH to instant payments to Fedwire. There's probably are going to be shifts, but none of us can predict it. And if you can start it all, you partner with someone who can put it all into an ISO format to begin with, it's a lot easier to then make your ISO payments. And even for something like ACH, you can translate ISO back into ACH. I've done it, been there, done that. And so I think that's the really hard thinking that a bank needs to do right now is, when do I rip off that Band-Aid and truly convert to an ISO format?
Let's stick with that Band-Aid metaphor there. Let's think of it this way. To rip off that Band-Aid, obviously banks can't do it themselves. They can't do it out of whole cloth because of the legacy systems, the time, the potential for error, and then all sorts of negative ripple effects. So let's talk a little bit about how an API approach starts to address technical infrastructure that on a good day functions in spite of itself in some respects, okay? And on a bad day really doesn't work well to do what we're talking about here, which is to really be able to get its arms around ISO. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of an API and a platform approach that starts to be, correct me if I'm wrong, a way to get that Band-Aid taken off, but without too much pain involved.
And that's certainly, what we would advocate is, the use of APIs where, I've seen multiple companies who have come up with, a single payment initiation API that can work across multiple ISO formats, multiple ISO rails, because, sadly, not all of them are being implemented identically. But you can create a payment API that can feed into all of them and take out, a lot of the, file translation and all of the things that are happening now, proprietary file formats. If you move to the APIs, then you can eliminate all of that. We're starting to see a lot of end customers and, particularly fintechs who don't want to talk with their banks with anything other than APIs. So you're catering to that market as well, where they've said, I don't want to send you a file. I just want to talk to you via an API. I've got people who know how to do that. And then further, the APIs, because they're real time, they're highly performant, they're high volume, there's no queuing, very resilient. They run well in the cloud, which is another place that everybody is going. I think we've gotten over the fear of payments in the cloud and realize that really makes sense. So if you put APIs between even your existing bank infrastructure, because no bank can rip out all of their infrastructure at one time. But if you put APIs between your existing, I'll say, initiation channels and the various networks, you can start to decouple. And then maybe one at a time, you can go back and change some of those channels to support some of the more sophisticated use cases, but you don't have to do it all at once. So maybe it's not ripping the Band-Aid off as much as, starting to make small little gains along that spectrum, but putting something, in the middle that will help you make those changes on your timeline, is very valuable. There was another survey that was done that estimated, even at a medium-sized bank, there are something like 200 systems on average that are impacted or that should be impacted by ISO if you were leveraging it all the way throughout your infrastructure. So, it is not a small change to embrace. And that's why we believe, the route is APIs, and that they can really help you insulate those back office systems from, or front office in the terms of client systems, insulate them from having to be changed all at once.
So with all of this in the mix, right, you have a more intuitive step-by-step, but also specific to the organization, the FI's readiness to do it. As you mentioned, you can scale into this as you need to. You've got the API, you've got the cloud, you have an ability to really start to address the technical challenges. Let's talk a little bit about what we might envision a fully realize Fedwire existence looks like. You gave me an example earlier of the way you could have some real robustness and compliance, sanction screening, things like that. Let's talk, if we could, about some of the other use cases. You mentioned sophisticated use cases. I'd like to get into that a little bit. What does an FI's client, and we can talk about the enterprise, or we can talk about, please get as detailed as you like, where they start to realize the positive impact of this in their own operations when it comes to making payment, not just to make them more secure, to get the visibility, transparency, to know what where the money is, where it needs to be, what's going on. Take me through a fully realized, and if you'd like to get, maybe even, transformative post-Fedwire existence. What does it look like?
Well, we're seeing many banks who this is the catalyst to really implement I'm going to say payment hub, and I'm cautious in saying that because it's a different definition to every bank, but to cease having such hard and fast lines between different payment types. So if you have, if you're using a single API for payment initiation and it handles, talking to the networks, for example, then you can start looking at things like not having siloed bank operations. So right now, most of the banks you walk in, you're going to have a Fedwire operation, an ACH operation, an RTP operation. They're all going to be very siloed and very separate. If you go down this path of more of a payments hub, what banks believe is they can use the same procedures, the same staff to a large extent. And, for example, Fedwire is very lumpy. Fedwire volumes, are double on the beginning and end of the month that they are other days. And so it's really hard to staff. So I managed wire transfer operations at one point. So really hard to staff for that. Whereas, ACH, for example, the volumes are ahead of that because, even in today's same day ACH world, many companies are still originating their files a day or two in advance. So being able to have the same process for dealing with insufficient funds situations, fraud checking, sanctions checking, all of that, having one set of interfaces, to your posting systems, to your sanction systems, to your fraud systems, we see that as the future. And based on the banks that I'm talking to, that's what they see, is treating a payment as a payment, and where it ends up is less significant than it is now. So that's where we see the trend heading.
So circling back to the implementation, the ISO dates, I'll call them, right, to different schemes, and certainly different regions are looking at different hard and fast dates to be there. Now, some of these timeframes keep getting pushed out, right? So we all know there's some challenges involved. What would you suspect we might see? Because you mentioned earlier, this is a global initiative, it's a global effort, and a global standard of messaging. Do you suspect that there might be a better recognition on the part of FIs of the limitations that they have? And actually, would they start to examine the API approach more fully? Would there be a domino effect? They see other people doing it, they start to take that on board. How will it work?
Yes, I think so. I think, many of the banks in the US are getting their feet wet now with Swift, since Swift now supports ISO. And I think that will lead them to, starting to migrate it to, Fedwire, RTP. There's so much impetus for moving to that ISO format. And I do think that it will be a catalyst for banks to step back and say, I don't want to keep patching my Swift system and my Fedwire system and my RTP system and my FedNow system. Isn't there a better way to do this? Again, back to a single, I'll say warehouse, clearinghouse that all of those instructions come into, and then it handles the integration out to those various payment networks. So insulating the customer, and this has been, nirvana in the payment industry for a long time. Customers shouldn't have to know or care how their payment is going to get executed to a large extent. They should say, I need this payment to be made, in this time frame, and that might be right now, instantly, or I need it to be made 2 days from now, and you bank get it there however best you can. And I give you one set of instructions, regardless of how it's going to be paid.
Last question goes to you, and it's sort of general. What have I missed if we haven't addressed it you'd like to point out?
I really think that one of the challenges with ISO is, we've really hit on it. It's, it is not a small undertaking. It's not a small format. And, banks have really got to be prepared to hold all of that data. And then, we as an industry need to start really putting some thought into, okay, now we have the capability to send all of this data. I don't think that's really happening in a lot of areas because, as I said, rightfully, they've been focused on making the transition. Now we as an industry need to start coming up with the really cool things like how we integrate into your accounts payable system or your accounts receivable, and give you a really smooth process for eliciting the information from you. Wire, particularly if you look at Fedwire, systems are very basic right now. Nobody's spent a lot of time on structured data. I don't say nobody. Few banks have spent much time on structured data. And now we need to say, okay, we finally crossed this hurdle. How do we truly effectively leverage this? How do we make it easy for customers to give us all that data so that their counterparty can consume it and it truly benefits both sides of the equation, the originator and the receiver of that payment?
It's certainly an ambitious undertaking, but one that
Yes.
pays dividends if it's done right. And it's what that old saying, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So so I think that will be it. So Laura, I want to thank you for the time. Thank you for the insight.
Okay.
Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.